Aloha, my name is Wally Amos. The story I'm about to share is one of courage, pain, hope, and frustration. It's also one of the most inspirational stories I've ever heard. It's the story of John Corcoran, a successful developer who was unable to read or write. The story originally appeared in Esquire magazine. It is entitled The Man Who Couldn't Read, and it was written by Gary Smith. Slowly, so the bed wouldn't creak, the millionaire who couldn't sleep rose and walked barefoot to the bookshelves. Tonight, he whispered to himself, please let it happen tonight. He turned on the lamp. He moved past the two framed rectangles of glass on the wall, past his college diploma, past his teaching certificate, and fell upon the book cover, the one filled by the angry black face. He stared into the rage and hurt in the author's eyes. He moved his fingers across the title, Soul on Ice. This man understands, the millionaire thought. This man, too, is a prisoner, an outsider. Maybe this man will help me tonight. His thumb riffled the pages. Don't force it, he told himself. This man is screaming. This man writes words that jump into your ears and eyes. Just stand here, very calmly, and let them come in. All his life? Is that how long he would have to play this game? He lay back down in bed and looked at his wife. No one else knew his secret. Not his two children, not his friends, not his old college professors, not the high school students he had taught for 18 years, not the business associates in his multi-million-dollar real estate developer company in Southern California. Only Kathy knew. They would take everything if they found out. The diploma and teaching certificate, the apartment complexes and shopping centers and rental properties, the Mercedes, and the big house overlooking the ocean. Or they'd refuse to believe his secret, insist he was playing them for fools. None of them understood what night sweat could do to a man. If he needed one badly enough, was there any charade a man couldn't play? John remembered a spring day back in fourth grade, back when the realization that he would be forever different from everyone else had begun to come over him. He had run out of class at 3 p.m., aching for some arena in which to prove he wasn't really the boy who sat at his desk, stupid and silent as a stone, and then had felt his legs moving toward the school's ball field, even though he was too young to play. Standing behind the batting cage with his glove on his hand, he watched the game with hungry eyes, noticing that neither team wore uniforms and there were no outfield fences, and how the big kids on the other school's team belted the ball over the right fielder's head his first 2 times up. Now there were 2 outs, the bases loaded. The big kid at the plate again, and John felt himself moving slowly, silently, out to deep right field. Then, crack! The ball was arcing across the sky, and boys all over the field were shouting and running. And suddenly, John Corcoran could feel it, smug and stinging inside the glove on his left hand. And the umpire signaled out, and all the players on his school's team were racing toward the bench, and he was racing with them, heart thumping with excitement and fright. He was in the game now. How could he possibly get out? He kept stealing looks at the manager and the boys, waiting for them to call his bluff, to send him home. "You bat third this inning," barked the manager. He walked to the plate as if in a dream. 3 fastballs hissed by him. "Strike 3!" roared the ump. Yes, there it was, the story of John Corcoran's life. He could play the part, trick the enemy, infiltrate the game. But at midnight, the moment of truth, when the millionaire stood alone in his pajamas with a book in his hands. Why hadn't he just refused to play? Why hadn't he just shoved away their books and diplomas and white-collar upper-class dreams? Even now, at 52, he couldn't quite understand why he had stayed in a classroom for 35 years, why he'd gone back for 80 more credits after he had graduated college, why he hadn't fled academia the moment he had stolen his passport, received his degree. Like a Jew in Nazi Germany, he'd say, who gets off a boxcar headed for the concentration camp and then gets back on? Crazy, he'd say, shaking his head. An absolutely crazy thing to do for a man who couldn't read or write. That's how he spoke and thought. All analogy and metaphor, all intuition and unfinished sentences. Sometimes bewildering, sometimes brilliant. The left side of his brain, the cool, logical lobe a man used to arrange symbols in a sequence, had always seemed to misfire. Some words, in an obvious context, he had learned to memorize and master. Stop on a street sign, exit over a doorway. But tuck them into the middle of a sentence and they mocked him. Letters traded places, vowel sounds lost themselves in the tunnel of his ears, and yet his blue eyes filled with tears, and his Adam's apple climbs up his throat a lot these days. If only someone had sat next to that little boy, put an arm around his shoulder, and said, "I know you can't read, John. It won't be easy, but I'll help you. Don't be scared. It's going to be okay." Then he could have learned. Instead, in second grade in Santa Fe, New Mexico, they put him in the dumb row. Stubborn little brat. Just sits there when you ask him to read or write a sentence. We'll cure that. Open your hands, John. Open your hands. The ruler smacked against his palms. That'll teach him to read. His third grade nun handed a yardstick to the children when John refused to read or write, ordered him to roll up his pants and let each student in his row have a crack. Which was worst? He wonders now sometimes, the stinging flush or the never-ending silence. That was how his fourth grade teacher had tried to cure him, by asking him to read and then letting 1 minute of quiet pile upon the next and the next, until the little boy thought he must suffocate, and then passed him on to the next grade and to the next teacher. John Corcoran never failed a year in his life. His parents, perhaps they wondered why their son would arrange to have one of his sisters read the community chest cards in Monopoly. Or maybe his parents' search for a place to belong sucked all the time and energy from wandering out of them. Somewhere they would find it. Somewhere these two orphans who had married would find a home. Somewhere, somehow, in St. Louis or Springfield or Santa Fe, in Amarillo or Abilene or Albuquerque, in Los Alamos or Roswell or Ajo or Parker or Blythe or Ensenadas, or just by moving to the other side of town, they would re-find the magic of the days when they dated, back when he was a center for the Minneapolis Red Jackets professional football team and she was a Chicago fashion model. Pack up the 6 kids, pack up the U-Haul trailer. The world would be a better place in the next town, and the next, and the next. By the time he graduated high school, John had lived in 35 houses and attended 17 schools. His dad was a teacher and a coach. He consumed words as if they were food, 2 newspapers a day, and Gone with the Wind in a single sitting one night. How could a boy explain to a dad like him his nausea each Friday morning before the weekly spelling test? How could he say to him, "Dad, I can't read"? His father was always on the run, coming home at 6:30 p.m. from football or baseball practice, scrambling up some eggs for his 5 girls, and little boy running off to a second job teaching night school or selling cars or insurance. His mom had an asthmatic daughter on her mind or on her knee half the day, then rushed off at 3 o'clock to work the late shift at the local drugstore. They would go without furniture or new clothes or a Christmas tree, then rent a house for twice what they could afford so that their children would grow up in the right neighborhoods, so that their dream, at least, would have the proper shingles and floorboards and beams. That was the gift and the curse they gave to their little boy who couldn't read. An injustice, a lousy paycheck. Don't sit there. Take a night course. Reach for the stars. Head west. The Corcorans are winners. The Corcorans don't settle for second best. You break the news to your mother this time, John. It's a much better job. No way a man can turn it down. God knows nobody wanted her to feel the way she did that day back in 45 when John was 8, that day Franklin Roosevelt died, and she looked around and saw her life once more packed up in cardboard boxes, and she cried, why don't we just turn on the gas? Sometimes, when the car was loaded and the kids were wedged in and another town was receding behind them, his sisters laughed and called themselves Irish Okies. Sometimes they cried. Not John, though. Each town was a new place to start over, to infiltrate the game. Who knew? Maybe he could stop beating his head against his pillow at night and promising to say a rosary to God every day from now to kingdom come in exchange for a miracle. Maybe in the next town he could read. He entered junior high school. It was no longer a game. Now it was war. John Corcoran against the literate world. Now he had to change classes for each subject, to hide his secret from 6 teachers instead of 1. All those dumb rows and yardsticks and awful tricks, of course. How to read a human being and smell warmth or danger. How an illiterate with 2 good fists, a quick wit, and a handsome smile could adapt and survive. No longer could he sit at his desk and wait for the humiliation to come. The stakes had grown too high now, the shame too steep. He had to walk into a classroom and size it up in a heartbeat. He had to somehow influence the people and the atmosphere inside it. He had to take control. This teacher, this subject, this school, what strategy would work best? Sit in the front row, clean the erasers, become the teacher's pet? Slink toward the back of the room and look for someone wearing glasses to cheat off? Or choose a seat in the middle, remain pleasant, silent, become the invisible man? Quickly, John made a decision. Which teachers to talk sports with, which to stare down, which to act so crazed in front of that they would be afraid to call his name. Don't laugh at John, a 9th grade teacher ordered her class. There's something wrong with him. Yes, there is. There is, he wanted to scream. Instead, he stood and walked like a spastic across the room, threw them far off the scent, grinned as everyone roared. Couldn't any of them see? He yearned to be his church's altar boy, but couldn't read the prayers. He longed to be his school's crossing guard, but they dismissed him for poor grades. He ached to be the all-American boy, not the class clown or the discipline problem. But any label was better than the dreaded one, the unspeakable one. He can't even read. Manipulate. He never liked that word. It sounded cruel. It sounded evil. My God, he was just a frightened teenager with raging hormones trying to get by. Orchestrate. That was better. Orchestrating girls to help him write essays. orchestrating pals to read him the math problem or whisper the instructions for the next assignment in typing class. "What's wrong, Corky? Can't you read?" they would ask in jest now and then. Duh. "No, I can't read," he would say, his jaw hanging stupidly, making them laugh. His senior year of high school, he would be voted homecoming king, go steady with the valedictorian, and star on a basketball team en route to the state championship game, only to have to move 60 miles away at mid-season. He would never say, "Read this for me," when he needed to know what was written on a page. "What does this mean to you?" he would say, or "What do they want here?" He wouldn't say, "Write this for me," when he needed to turn in a paper. He'd say, "Let's work on this together." Start pacing and thinking out loud, leave his buddy sitting there with the paper and the pen. No one felt orchestrated by John. No one felt used. He would pick you to play on his team even if everyone knew you were a clod. Present your case to a pretty girl, stand by your side in a fight. And before you knew him well enough to catch the fear in his eyes, he was packed and gone. In the 10th grade, he made the conscious decision. He would bury his shame forever, play out the masquerade, never let down his guard. Keep watching from the edge of his eye when the others were reading silently in class to see when he should turn the page. Scribble something, anything, inside his notebook when the others were taking notes. Mimic even their facial expressions, then cover his page so no one would see. Stare down at his right hand. Make sure again and again he hadn't fallen back into his bad habit of holding his pen between his third and fourth fingers. One mistake could be fatal. Any moment, any corner he turned, who knew what threat might arise? "Try again, John." You're sure you can't read that letter on the screen?" the eye doctor asked when he was in 11th grade. "Yes, of course I can see it. I just don't know what letter it is." No, sir. I'm sorry, I can't." That was how John got his first pair of glasses. His mom kissed him when he graduated and kept talking about college. His 52-year-old dad took a job as a hotel night clerk in order to attend summer school for a California teaching credential. Morning sessions at San Diego State, afternoons at the University of San Diego. "Well, why not, John? Reach for the stars, son. You can be anything you want. Education, that's the key." These were his role models, people who never doubted the American dream, no matter how deftly it dodged them. It was always just a few more credits or miles away. But college? March right into the belly of the beast? He was 6'4", could dunk a basketball, had been selected all-conference and offered a scholarship by the University of Wyoming. But no, it would be insane to consider. Pure suicide. But what about junior college? He spent a year and a half at Riverside Community College in California, then one semester at Palos Verdes, sat next to the right girls, stole the right answers, smiled the right smiles, and somehow survived. Cheating? Was it really cheating? His mind grasped concepts quickly, understood math intuitively. He was smarter than half the damn kids in the room, willing to work twice as hard. Should he be shut out just because a couple of wires in his brain were crossed? The University of Texas at El Paso, then Texas Western, offered him a basketball scholarship. His spirits soared. His heart sank. He was in the game now. How could he possibly get out? He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and recrossed enemy lines. "Welcome to campus. John, how about a beer?" He would take the can, walk into the bathroom, empty it in the sink and refill it with water. No, the stakes were too high now. Not even a sip, not even for a second could he afford to lose control. His eyes roamed every room he entered, searching for the newspaper or magazine or pen that could betray him, the nitpicker that could trip him up, the escape hatch he could use to slip away. He quizzed each new friend. Which teachers required papers? Which gave essay tests? Which gave multiple choice? He studied the seating configurations and the faces in every classroom. Which students might slip him an answer? Which might squeal? Wrinkles always sit behind people with wrinkles. Older students were most likely to rat. He registered for 7 classes a semester, dropped the 2 most difficult during the 6-week grace period. The minute he stepped out of a class, he tore the pages of scribble from his notebook in case anyone asked to see his notes, returned to his room and shredded them. He stared at thick textbooks in the evening so his dormitory roommate wouldn't doubt, then joined a fraternity, drank can after can of water in order to tap the treasure chest of old term papers and old tests in order to feel as if he finally belonged. He watched classmates in chemistry memorize the element chart in an hour. It took him 15. And he lay in bed, listening to the clock chew away the night, exhausted but unable to sleep, unable to make his whirling mind let go. 30 straight days. God! 30 straight days he'd go to Mass. Crack of dawn, he promised, if only God would let him get his degree. U.S. Government 101, 102. 2-semester class, 4 essay tests, required for graduation. The monster. No way to use the finger signals from his buddy that he had used to get through educational statistics. No cheat sheets on narrow adding machine paper scrolled up his long-sleeved shirt this time. No old tests, no clue what the questions would be. He took a seat in the back, slid against the wall with the open window. Carefully, with no idea what he was writing, he copied the questions from the blackboard into his blue book. His eyes stole around the room. Silently, slowly, his hand moved toward the window. The blue book fell to the grass. The smart, skinny kid, the one John was setting up a date for, scooped it up, sat beneath a tree, and began writing. John began scribbling in a second blue book, watching the clock, the teacher, the window, the other students, sweat running down his ribs. The book slid back in the window. Bingo! 4 times, never caught. 30 straight days. God, that's a promise. No, that's not cheating. Not when you don't have any choice. That's not a sin. Is it? Is it? He staggered into the doctor's office one day, a bundle of frayed nerves. Tension, the doctor diagnosed. Not enough sleep. For his cure, the doctor laid in John's hand a book on how to handle stress. Read it, the doctor said. An odd thing happened. He got the diploma. He gave God his 30 days of Mass. Now what, John? Now what? Maybe he was addicted to the edge. Maybe he was panting too hard for his father's love. Maybe the thing he felt the most insecure about, his mind, was the thing he needed most to have admired. Maybe that's why, in 1961, John became a teacher. A teacher. The perfect inconceivability for an illiterate. The perfect cover. He called his father from El Paso. Dad, he said, I had the application sent to your house, but I don't know if I'll be home in time to turn it in. Think you could fill it out? Thanks. He taught world history for 2 years at Carlsbad High in California, and then for 1 at Corcoran High. He had Robert Ramirez, the only student in class he could depend on to recognize every word, stand each day and read the textbook to the class. Again? Robert finally complained. Can't anybody else here read? I don't even think the teacher can. Ha ha, Robert. Very funny. He gave the students standardized tests, used a form with a hole punched next to each correct answer, and laid it right over the student's exam. Any dolt could do it. He lay in bed for hours on weekend mornings and wondered why he felt depressed. He met a woman who had lived in the same town in California all her life, gone to the same high school as her mother had, grown up in a house with 4 generations of her Portuguese Azorean family, a straight-A student, a nurse, not a leaf like John, a rock. There's something I have to tell you, Kathy, he said one night in 1965 before their marriage. There's something I have to tell you, too, she said. Kathy, I can't read. He's a teacher, she thought. He must mean he can't read well. Well, said Kathy, I am RH negative. The subject was dropped, the 2 secrets dismissed. John didn't understand Kathy's until 5 years later, when their day-old baby died. Kathy didn't understand John's until 2.5 years later, when she overheard him struggling to read a children's book to their 18-month-old daughter. He began teaching social studies and sociology. He began to turn the old rules upside down. All his tests were oral. He brought in films and videos and guest speakers by the score. Let's move our desks into a circle, he told his students. Let's talk about ourselves and each other, about how we feel. Or he'd douse the lights, put a match to a candle, have everyone huddle around him and pretend they were in a cave on the verge of collapsing. Oh, if only they knew. Then say, maybe 1 or 2 of you can make it out. Who should go? Convince us. Tell us why. He became known as an innovator. His timing, the late 60s and the 70s, when the humanities were flowering in American high schools, was perfect. His state, California, that lover of the latest trend, was perfect too. Besides, how could the administration question him? He volunteered to take on the school's toughest kids and slowest learners, the Mexicans and Samoans and blacks whom traditional methods had failed. And he broke through those kids' walls. He fired their curiosity. He, honest to God, cared. He could reach a teenager's anger and hurt because it was his. But his vigil, would it ever end? That book you've been carrying around all week, Mr. Corcoran, what's it about? Here, read it. Tell me what you think. He was a spy with phony papers, an actor on a rickety stage. While I've got you here in the office, Mr. Corcoran, can you fill in this employee insurance form? Sorry, I have to take it home with me. Got a conference with a parent in 2 minutes. Here, John, can you read this mimeograph and give me some feedback? Sorry, just got back from the ophthalmologist. My eyes are dilated. Can't. Always in a hurry, always a little distracted, always forgot his glasses, always burying pens under paper so the moment wouldn't come. Always tossing a dictionary at students who were stuck on a word. Funny, not just 1 dictionary in Mr. Corcoran's room, but 20 or 30 in case somehow one day everyone got stuck on a word. The morning bulletin, he let a student read it. A discipline problem, he handled it himself. If it went to the principal, he'd have to write a report. A stomachache, a fever, he went to school anyway, so he wouldn't have to write the substitute or lesson plan. He arrived early, stayed late, hung out in the library more than any other teacher, hauled in boxes of second-hand books he had bought at flea markets and dispensed them to the kids. My God, who could ever even remotely consider that it was all in the air he gave off, as if reading a birthday card out loud at a family gathering, glancing at a menu, or filling in his medical history at the doctors were a little beneath him. How coolly he could hand them to his wife, pick up a magazine, and leaf through it. Kathy was a good girl. She filled out his forms, read and wrote his letters. Why then, people would ask years later, when his long ruse was finished, why didn't he simply ask her to teach him to read and write? No! He couldn't humble himself before her that way. He couldn't truly believe that anyone could teach him that. Why didn't she simply insist? No! He could be a powerful, dominating man, a master of orchestration. Maybe, almost subconsciously, she needed to hold that one thing over him to keep the scales of their marriage from tipping. And if that moment ever came, that nightmare when the literates locked the door, encircled him, stuck a book before him, and screamed, "Read!" John Corcoran had a contingency plan even for that. Fake a heart attack, a stroke. That's how much the masquerade meant. And he was pulling it off. He had it almost down to a science. So why? He wondered sometimes now. Why was he still starved for something more tangible to assure him he was okay? At age 28, he borrowed $2,500, bought a second house, fixed it up, and rented it. Bought and rented another and another. Purchased some land, had a few houses built, started visualizing things that men who used the other half of their brains couldn't see. He worked harder and harder. His business got bigger and bigger until he needed a full-time secretary to read him his correspondence, a full-time lawyer to read his contracts, a partner, his wife's brother, to oversee the office. And then one day, his accountant told him he was a millionaire. Damn, his teaching colleagues said. Never realized Corcoran could be so shrewd, so good at taking risks. How'd that ever happen? A millionaire. Perfect. Who'd noticed that a millionaire always pulled on doors that said pushed? Or paused before entering public bathrooms, waiting to see from which one the men walked out? Who'd notice that he got lost when you gave him directions, that he had his subcontractors write in their own names when he issued checks, that he hardly had any close friends? He quit teaching in 1979. His staff grew to 20 people. Taiwanese American investors began to back him. 25 limited partnerships joined his stable. He deserved this, didn't he? Hadn't he overcome twice as many obstacles, hyperventilated twice as hard as anyone else? Wasn't he hyperventilating still? Yes, this was the horror. The more land he bought, the more construction loans he signed his name to, the wealthier and more successful he became. The more and more the man who couldn't read had to lean upon them, the literates. The ones he had never really trusted, the ones who had smacked his palms, whipped his calves, condemned him to the dumb row. But he was home free. Why'd he feel more and more scared? The walls of each room in his house began to vanish, covered by shelf after shelf of books. He spent hours during vacations sitting in a bookstore in a stuffed chair by the fireplace, gazing at pages. He stared at 2 or 3 network news programs each evening and then down at his newspaper, hoping, please, to connect the words he heard with the hieroglyphics. He went to 2 classes of a speed reading course. He desperately lunged for magic. Magic, a miracle. He was convinced now that it would take something superhuman to solder the short circuit in his head. The Bible, he thought on some nights. Wouldn't a just God let him read the Bible? He grabbed the book, opened it to the first page. No? Well then, he'd punish God, refuse to believe in him, erase him from the cosmos. And then yo-yoing back in a cold sheen of Irish Catholic sweat. Stop! Up with the house lights. Move to the back of the theater now. Stand behind the very last row. From here you can see it. See all that the award-winning actor cannot see. The deepening resentment of the wife, the growing tension of the overworked father, the gradual erosion of family life, the mounting anxiety of his partner, Kathy's brother, because John can't seem to stop risking expanding, the inevitable screech of the national economy and the California real estate market. In 1982, the bottom began to fall out, the charade to shatter. His properties began to sit empty, his creditors to call, his financial backers to evaporate. Sell, John, his wife's brother urged. Take a loss. Sell now. Impossible. He couldn't. He began laying off employees so he could pay the interest on his loans, whittling his staff from 20 to 3, working 16 hours a day to compensate. The Taiwanese American pulled out. A zillion documents were piling on his desk. Nearly all the front men he had gathered around himself to interpret them were gone. Threats of foreclosures and lawsuits began tumbling out of envelopes. File bankruptcy, his wife's brother urged. Go Chapter 11, now. No, never. Please, Kathy, did he have to get down on his knees and beg? He needed her more and more to write and read letters for him, but she was working long hours with terminal cancer patients at a clinic and had nothing left at 9 p.m. to give. His son's grades went to hell all at once. My God, what if the boy can't read? What if John had passed it along in his blood? His driver's license was about to expire again. Who had time anymore to memorize which box to check for 25 questions on each of the written test's 5 possible versions? Each waking moment, it seemed, he was pleading with bankers to extend his loans, coaxing builders to stay on the job, negotiating with lawyers to settle out of court, trying to make sense of the pyramid of paper. His wife's brother walked away, sued him for $10 million. Kathy got ripped this way and that. Another man sued him, then another and another. His shoulder and neck muscles bunched up like fists. He couldn't sleep. He lay on the floor some nights, spread his arms, and begged God to save him. They were ganging up on him, the bastards. They were tearing down the facade plank by plank. And they wouldn't stop until he was alone and penniless, and they had him on the witness stand, sworn to the truth under threat of perjury. And the man in the black robe said, "The truth, John Corcoran. Can you not even read?" In the fall of 1986, at the age of 48, he did 2 things he swore he never would. He put up his house for collateral to obtain one last construction loan. And he walked into the Carlsbad Library and told the woman in charge of the tutoring program, "I can't read." He cried. He filled with dread. He was certain it was hopeless. He was placed with a 65-year-old grandmother named Eleanor Condit. Strange how she didn't seem horrified by his true face. Strange how she just encouraged him to go on. She sat with him through a TV series on how words came to be, on the history of the English language, and the monster began losing its snarl. And painstakingly, letter by letter, phonic by phonic, the way it might have been done 40 years ago, she began teaching him to tame it. Within 14 months, John Corcoran's land development company began to revive, and John Corcoran could read. The next step was confession, a speech before 200 stunned businessmen in San Diego. To heal, he had to come clean. He had to give all those years of pain a reason. He was placed on the board of directors of the San Diego Council on Literacy, began traveling across the country to give speeches and lobby legislators on the need to attack America's invisible epidemic, the one that afflicts a staggering 85% of its juvenile delinquents, 75% of its citizens without jobs. Illiteracy is a form of slavery, he would cry, a form of child neglect, child abuse. We can't waste time blaming anyone. As a country, we need to become obsessed with teaching people to read now. He could sleep now that each minute of his life didn't need to be controlled. He read every book or magazine he could get his hands on, every road sign he passed, out loud as long as Kathy could bear it. It was glorious. It was like singing. And then one day it occurred to him, one more thing he could finally do. Yes, that dusty box in his office, that sheaf of papers bound by ribbon. A quarter century later, John Corcoran could read his wife's love letters.
Reading words is quite a gain, and I'm not about to complain, but I am obligated to explain some of our pain without casting any blame. We all have something to gain. My name is John Corcoran. For 40 years, I have felt the curse of illiteracy. I have felt like I carry the shame and the blame. I have felt dumb, and I had heard people say that if you don't learn how to read in the second or third grade, you'll never learn how to read. That is not correct. It's never too late to learn how to read. I learned to read when I was 48 years old. The hour is here for a literate America, and we are the men and women of that hour. Your understanding of the illiteracy problem in America is an important part of the healing and rehabilitation of our country's most important natural resources, our people. If you will lead, others will follow. Our children and our people are waiting for your support, your encouragement, your commitment, and your leadership. I invite you to teach us to read. I invite you to learn to read.